You know, for a channel like this that's all about business, I actually hardly ever talk about investing. As the name implies, I tend to focus more on what's been happening with the companies themselves. But the fact is that many of the companies I talk about are on the stock market, and shares of them could be bought by most of the people watching this. Truly, investing in the stock market has never been more accessible, and that is mostly due to the rise of the discount brokerage. I'm going to talk more about what that is and why it's significant, but the four biggest that stand out above all of the others, and therefore the four that I've chosen to focus on, are Charles Schwab, Fidelity, TD Ameritrade, and E-Trade. We are talking about millions of accounts that combine for trillions of dollars invested with them. And there are many others like Webull or Robinhood, but those are much newer and as of right now anyway aren't quite as big. So for this video, I've chosen to focus on the big four. I'm going to make some comparisons between them, talk about how they've grown and how they've shaped the industry. The true beginning of all of it could be traced back to May 1st, 1975, commonly referred to as May Day. See, before that day, going all the way back to the 1700s, the Commission for Stock Trading was essentially regulated by the SEC, meaning that the brokerage you bought your stock through was legally forced to charge a fixed amount of money anytime you bought anything, which happened to be much higher than almost anything that you would see in recent times. If you were looking to buy 5 shares or 5,000 shares, it would be the same commission to execute that order, and it didn't matter which brokerage you went to either. Now obviously, if you're only buying 5 shares and paying a lot for the transaction itself, those 5 shares are really going to have to perform well for it to even be worth it. You could see how that made things less accessible for small-time investors. Well, on that day in 1975, in a controversial move, the SEC decided that they would get rid of that rate requirement and allow the brokerages to charge whatever they wanted. Many of them took that opportunity to actually raise their prices, but there was one small brokerage that stood out by choosing to lower them and pioneered a new business model in the process. Charles Schwab is the name of a man who received an MBA from Stanford University in 1961. 2 years later, he created a newsletter that offered investment advice. At its peak, that newsletter had 3,000 subscribers, each paying $84 for their yearly subscription. In 1971, he started a company that would operate as a traditional brokerage in addition to publishing that newsletter. Then, in 1975, following the big May Day decision, he realized that he could attract customers by dramatically lowering that commission price to a point where it was about half of what the others were charging. And he was able to charge so little by cutting costs on his end and offering a very stripped down service. See, to this point, brokerages traditionally offered investment advice, tax planning, consultations, whatever. But at Charles Schwab, you wouldn't find any of this. He would execute your order, and that was it. It sounds simple enough, but it was revolutionary. The traditional companies became known as full-service brokers, while Charles Schwab and the others that followed his lead became known as discount brokers. So all of these companies that I'm focusing on today are basically evolved versions of the model that Charles Schwab established in 1975. Aside from the low prices, he also found success by building trust and availability. He wanted his customers to feel more personally connected and cared for. He soon offered 24-hour trading through the phone, advertised it in the newspaper using a picture of himself to kind of attach a face to the company and add a human element, in addition to opening local branches. In reality, everything could have been done over the phone, but many people, especially back then, preferred the human interaction and that local feeling that they provided. And that right there is the overall friendly, approachable image that they've tried to convey over the years, exemplified in their 2000s Talk to Chuck campaign. By the 1980s, he had used all of these tactics to establish a multi-million-dollar company that had essentially created and was dominating the discount brokerage industry. Some changes followed. In 1983, they were bought by Bank America for $55 million, who was able to provide loans to them and help them grow, but they were only together for 4 years. In 1987, Charles Schwab himself got together with a group of investors and took out some loans to buy the company for $280 million. But then, just a few months later, he put the company on the stock market so they could pay down that debt and have money to further expand. That's kind of an Inception type thing, right? Being able to buy shares of Charles Schwab through Charles Schwab? I don't know. In the year 2000, it's worth mentioning that they briefly departed from their longtime strategy of hands-off investing for everyday consumers when they bought a wealth advisory company called U.S. Trust for $2.7 billion. That company was pretty much the opposite in that they specialized in hands-on investing for wealthy people. I believe that this was their attempt to balance out their business, to encompass everything, but they proved to be too different and were sold for $3.3 billion just 6 years later. So that's Charles Schwab. The man himself remained CEO until 2008 and remains a major shareholder, making him one of the richest people in the world with a net worth of over $13 billion. His company was truly the original, and despite rising competition over the past almost 50 years, have remained at the top. TD Ameritrade, I wouldn't say is quite as pioneering as Charles Schwab, but they have made an impact. They started off in the early 1970s in Omaha, Nebraska. This guy Joe Ricketts started a local investment bank that in 1975 also took advantage of the deregulation by offering lower commissions. And they too in various ways helped shape the industry, like in 1988 when they were the first to offer touch-tone phone trading. But in 1997 is when they really started to grow. That year, they combined their various segments together under the name Ameritrade, which allowed them to utilize their first ever national ad campaigns, and they became a public company. Shortly after, they started acquiring all of these competing firms, leading up to 2006 when they bought TD Waterhouse USA for $3.3 billion. That right there was the brokerage unit of Toronto Dominion Bank, that's where the TD comes from, and that formed one of the largest discount brokerages, though still much smaller than Charles Schwab. But the piece of the story that joins all of this together is in 2020, TD Ameritrade was actually bought by Charles Schwab, bringing together two of the original and biggest discount brokerages that have been competing alongside each other for decades. At the time it was announced, the CEO of Charles Schwab said, "This is a historic moment that brings together two leading companies with proud and successful histories of making investing more accessible to all." Fidelity is a little different from the others in that it's the oldest of the four and is the only one that was already successful before 1975. It was actually started as the Fidelity Fund in 1930, right after the big stock market crash. By 1943, it had grown to have $3 million invested in it when it was bought by this man named Edward Johnston. He was a lawyer from Boston who believed that actively trading investments and seeking out lesser-known, potentially more speculative growth stocks would, in the long run, outperform the overall market. So that's how the fund was managed, and they were successful with the strategy. In the 1970s, they had success with money market funds as well. Notably, in 1974, they established the Fidelity Daily Income Trust, the first of its kind offered check writing. Where they become relevant to this video is in 1977, Edward Johnston retired from being chairman and CEO, and his son Ned Johnston took over. The following year, they established Fidelity Brokerage Services as a discount brokerage. Obviously, it was a few years after the other two that we talked about, but they were the first to establish one that was already considered to be a major financial institution. The overall company has since grown in multiple areas. By offering mutual funds, they become known for their 401k retirement accounts. I don't have as much to say about them as it pertains to this topic, but they too took advantage of the deregulation early on and are now one of the biggest brokerages out there. E-Trade is going to help fill in the rest of the story because whereas the other three were basically established as a direct result of the deregulation, E-Trade was not. I mean, maybe to some degree, but the bigger factor here was the internet. The person responsible is William Porter. He had earned degrees in both management and physics, and by the early 1980s, he was watching the prices of trading commissions get lower and lower. He was studying all the methods used by the discount brokers and figured that he could utilize computers to automate things and bring that price even lower. Remember, this was right when PCs were first becoming popular, so he established this company called Trade Plus that created a system where customers could place orders online. There was a subscription fee involved and it was offered through other brokerages. It attracted some attention before starting to fade. But the significant thing here is that in 1991, William Porter used the money provided by Trade Plus to establish E-Trade. This was an early example of an online brokerage, offering the service years before the other three. They made deals with other online companies like AOL and Yahoo to make the service more readily available. They've been trading on the stock market since 1996 and started acquiring all of these other massive online companies starting in the early 2000s. They were actually almost the ones to acquire TD Waterhouse instead of Ameritrade back in 2004, which would have created created, I guess, E-Trade. And then I'm sure many of us remember that E-Trade baby that did show us how easy it was to use their platform. Finally, in 2020, E-Trade was acquired by the investment bank Morgan Stanley. It cost them $13 billion, which was the biggest takeover by a US bank in over a decade since the financial crisis. Overall, when talking about these four companies, it has been a story of accessibility through lowering commissions and online platforms. Starting in 1975, all of these companies were given the freedom to compete based on price, and that's what they've been doing ever since. What may have cost hundreds of dollars in the past has been gradually coming down to a point where today it's pretty much free. Robinhood started offering commission-free trading back in 2013, while the others were still in the $5 to $10 price range, which was already a massive reduction. But then, the bigger event happened in October of 2019, when Charles Schwab, the market leader, announced that they'd be starting commission-free trades, and the other three competitors were practically forced to announce the same thing within the same week. All of them do have other means of generating revenue that tend to get financially complicated, but it has impacted them. It's believed that these recent acquisitions have been motivated, in part at least, by pressure to consolidate to help fight against the money from the lowering commissions. Which, by the way, may have its downsides as well. Many people have argued that it's become too easy, and people are recklessly making trades without doing proper research or considering the tax implications. It's a tricky issue, but the stock market overall has made people trillions of dollars over the past few decades, and I like to believe that making it more accessible and empowering people with their money and their investments has generally been a good thing. Let me know in the comments, which brokerage do you use, if any, and why do you prefer it over the others? Honestly, when comparing them with the prices and features and services, I don't see there being too much difference at this point. And I realize you'll find a million videos and articles doing in-depth comparisons, but in a broad sense, I think it just comes down to personal preference. Maybe one of them will have a specific account or fund or layout that you prefer, but honestly, I find them to be pretty similar. What I mean is that in most cases, I don't think your overall returns will be too much affected by the brokerage that you choose. Let me know if you agree with that, and any other thoughts you have about Charles Schwab, TD Ameritrade, Fidelity, E-Trade, or any of the others, leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.